Ladies and gentlemen, monks and nuns, householders, and any devas who might be listening, welcome to the Integral Stage Author Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and I'm sitting down with integrative Dharma Dragon Pema Dragpa, a guy who loves compassion-oriented big picture mandalas so much he's labored to combine several of them in his book, An Integral View of Tibetan Buddhism, Preserving Lineage Wisdom in the 21st Century. Now, this is a very interesting book, and it's lovely looking. It covers a huge range of stuff, from summaries of Nyingma Buddhism to the relevance of John Vervaeke's terminology to correspondence tracking the friendly disagreements between Pema and Ken Wilber to more general speculations about the role of legacy wisdom and Dharma heuristics in a transcultural information age. So one thing we could do is that I pretend to be an interviewer and ask a lot of niche questions about this book. But another thing we could do is just encounter each other and have an open two-way discussion about our shared love of the intersection between transcendental wisdom, developmental meta theory, and the thriving of beings. And all of those options sound good to me. So I'm thrilled to have him here. Hi, Pema.
Oh, awesome. Thanks so much, Layman. It's beautiful to be with you. The omniwind thriving of all beings. I'm fully on board with the project, and you've been enjoying that vast and profound project for many, many years now, let alone, let's say, maybe lifetimes, who knows? But at least in the more near term stuff we can see with our sense doors, like you're in it to win it for a lot of beings. And I have a bunch of gratitude for that, Layman.
That's a beautiful thing to hear. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought about while reading the book was you writing the book. I find that when I have the chance to bring a lot of the elements that I care about together in one place in a way that's plausibly useful to others, it's also deeply useful to me. It helps me integrate and synergize all these different facets that I've been holding. And when I've put many of my hunches in one place with a kind of logic that binds them together, it also feels like it liberates me to move on to other territories and problems. So just as a writer to a writer, I'm curious what the production of this book did for you.
Lovely. I mean, it was an extended process from about 2018 into 2023, so 5 or 6 or so years. And that's it was in between times. I pretty much live and serve as a volunteer to Tibetan Buddhist Center in upstate New York. So it was kind of in between, everyone, like so many of us, have very active, busy schedules. So it was like late hours and early morning hours. So yeah, it was, at that time, I was just crossing the 40s, the 40 threshold, and had a little bit of an encounter of I might really not, make it through this one. Kind of had a little bit of a near-death thing. And so then it was kind of in one way like this celebratory offering of what is some just amazing, awesome, lovely, powerful stuff that I've had the great fortune to come across. And that two big, Vajrayana Buddhism, the teachings of Buddha and Guru Rinpoche, and then also the Ken Wilber's meta-integrative frameworks. I've enjoyed that since I was in high school. So bringing those, trying to honor that, trying to really see what elegantly aligns and what doesn't, the push and the pull, and while really trying to stay true to my own kind of deep lineage connection in Tibetan Buddhism and according to the teachers I'm with and studying under. That was a lovely thing to really just do the tenderizing of that. And it was a deep exploratory process. And now that that's kind of completed and the book's out there and it's just kind of sitting there gathering dust, I think. I mean, a lot of it goes towards, it's nice to meta-theorize about all this stuff. And that's important and valuable. We need to architecture the thing and have engineering plans and reliable frameworks that we can apply ourselves, we can leave for others, we can co-create and bounce off of together forever into the future. And it really comes down to this moment of embodied awareness for me. I mean, how stable is this whole turquoise meta-integrative thing? It's easy to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. I mean, to walk the talk the walk and do all the combinations, that's kind of brought it home to I really need to have more attention on embodied practice. And that means remembering, coming back to again and again to a bodhicitta or meta-integrative mode, what Tibetan Buddhism calls the view. And that's a humbling thing because I'm mainly a student. I mean, for big time, really learning, exploring, adventuring, fumbling, mistaking, asking forgiveness and all. So I don't know, there's a lot I could say, Layman, about what it's opened up and kind of also paused. So yeah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting pathways that I know of that we can go down. And I
Yeah,
feel like there's some surprises we can find together.
I do too.
For the listener or the viewer, maybe I'd want to sort of frame a little bit more around, like, as I'm reading this, I'm trying to go, how is this guy holding the integral and Tibetan Buddhist situation, right? Which is sort of the emotional driver of a lot of the text.
Yeah.
So let me say kind of what I heard, and then you tell me if that sounds about right from your perspective as the author. Because there's different ways that integral meta theory in Tibetan Buddhism can be approached. Some forms of those things and some individuals within those things hold the balances and appreciations and authenticities differently. So there's a big spectrum of takes. Very generally, I might say that there's an argument for integrative Tibetan Buddhism, and that it's that we inhabit a transcultural, psychotherapeutic, developmentally oriented planetary information realm now, and that evolutionary coherent pluralism of some kind and a perspective based approach is essential for any spirituality who wants to show up in that kind of a world. And then the more specific argument for Tibetan Buddhism is that it's demonstrated that its particular heuristics and orientations considered as a whole not only produce reliable waking up experiences, but can significantly assist the integration of those experiences alongside a virtue-based approach to the full pie chart of human psychology and well-being. But that there's a flip side to all of those good things.
Yeah.
And the flip side is maybe that Tibetan Buddhists would feel that integrative theorists don't responsibly appreciate their pragmatism and comprehensiveness. And not only are the philosophers avoiding some real waking up practice, they're maybe not being fair in their reductive evaluations of Tibetan Buddhism. And then conversely, developmental theorists might say that Tibetan Buddhists are frequently stuck in the sort of the medieval ethnocentric social embedding that it comes out of, and that they don't take cleaning up and growing up quite seriously enough, and that there's an internal culture that tends to revert to magical thinking a lot of the time without clearly distinguishing the pre-conventional and the post-conventional. So like that's my sense of this tangle that I'm looking at as I'm reading the text. How accurate does that sound to you? Pretty good?
Pretty good. Yeah, it's a good tangle. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, it's strong argument. Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism is one example amongst hopefully a lot of them, of a deeply meta-integrative approach that's created itself in minds, in bodies, with people as culture and societies for centuries. And it has a very deep kind of meta-integrative impulses and structures according to Wilberian integral. And you can check off those boxes quickly with a general heuristic of, does it try to transcend the negative aspects of so-called pre-modern, modern, postmodern, post-postmodern? So it has to identify those and then try to, to some degree, like not reproduce those same limitations. And at the same time, it has to like vibrantly, like warmly welcome the like more healthier, the like kind of less extreme aspects of all those three aspects or four aspects: pre-modern, modern, postmodern, post-postmodern. I'm assuming your audience is like, this is like bread and butter basics for a lot of your audience members. So anyone who does that, trying to transcend and include, transcend the negative limitations and include the positive contributions in a well-rounded, cogent, coherent way as possible, as a practice or a set of practices, right? An ecology of practices, to Professor John Vervaeke's kind of terms, like a suite of practices. What Wilberian calls this all-qual approach, like, or integral life practice. That's 20 years old now. Like, so the argument is Tibetan Buddhism has done that, and we can just clearly kind of pretty easily look at that and say it's done some of these key features. But again, that's like 20 mile high bird's eye view. Then we get into the nitty gritty granular detail of like, all right, who's bypassing what? And what happened in such and such culture, and so a proclaimed teacher did what to who, and like we can get in the real life human details of how a model is breathed through together in the co-creative movement process called life. So, and I have a lot of, problems with how Buddhism's been applied or misapplied, for sure. Like, and mainly I need to keep remembering like how I am probably misapplying and not understanding and getting a bunch of things wrong and distorted, because I'm like, I know a teeny speck of Buddhism, let alone Mahayana Bodhisattva path, let alone Vajrayana Tantra Buddhism. I know a tiny little speck. And at the same time, I've looked closely enough to know that a speck really does include like an inexhaustible, fractally embedded universe of awesomeness. A speck has that too. So yeah, I think in general, the tangle of the book, which is just kind of a lot of lovely things I've come across and a lot of things I'm still very actively exploring myself in terms of, as a lived thing, how does it come down? In this moment, am I trying to have bodhicitta, or this a living, awakened heart mind kind of being in the world with others? Is that happening now or not? And not just is it happening as a state, but like all the connective tissues of my body and my states of body and states of mind and relationships and types of relationships and roles and worlds I'm a part of, like how fully immersive, enmeshed, embodied, extended is that presence of a way of bodhisattva? So how much am I in the connective mode? Oh, that's a relative relational way. And ultimately, or so-called absolute, like how much am I not locking into and fixating on any one streamline, wave, rung of any of those connections, but really keep releasing, use the model, use the map to basically compost itself into like the next better working model for this lived relationship right now. And that's an always ongoing question for like a practitioner of Buddhism in general. And I would hope for a integralist of any kind, whether you're metamodern or Game B or Gebsarian or like whatever this meta-integrative approach you're doing, like Jason Storming or Greg Enriquez, you talking, or there's a bunch of people exploring this so-called postmodern awareness and embodied culture society making. So there's some tangle to throw back at you, Layman.
I love the notion of a self-composting map. That's a beautiful thing. Um, I think one of the difficulties that people who are doing contemporary big model work are facing, right? And they've actually succeeded in facing a lot of the previous challenges, which is, they've got complexity, they've got development, they've got insight. Now they've got all this stuff that maybe was left out of a lot of the big picture work that at least the West was doing over the last few hundreds or thousands of years. But where that comes together with the embodied moment of practice is really an open question. I find that a lot of my work trends toward either the circumstance in which practice seems to be evoked in people, or to a modification of theory, which is, can we theorize what the functional principles were in different schools of spiritual practice? Maybe you and I had a bit of an exchange around that at the Metamodern Spirituality discussion at Limicon, because I think there is a philosophical bridge from describing what the world needs to describing what we think might have been the active principles underlying the practices. Because for sure, people who are building up a model, they don't have great examples of embodied practice communities. And it's very hard for them to evaluate what was a valid or non-valid version of that in the past, because there's so much promise and so much mythologizing going on at the same time. So there's a bridge there that I feel very passionate about trying to flesh out.
I love it. Yeah, I call them kind of as a shorthand meta heuristics, rules of thumb that can be applied in multiple like contexts, and you get some traction, you get some positive feedback response. They are workable. I think Buddhism in general is filled with those kind of core first principles or meta heuristics, like Four Noble Truths. suffering, cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, the path to cessation of suffering. There's so many. If you're Buddhist familiar at all, like the four seals or the four turnings or the it has 9 paths, the 4 philosophies included in Buddhism, the 6 paramita transcendental wisdom practices, like the 3 wisdoms, I think these are all pointing towards like some pretty core principled meta heuristics that are philosophically or scholastically robust in a variety of contexts, and also are embodied and practicable, like in oneself with one's mind and awareness, and in culture co-creation with others. And so these are some like super nuggets of deep first principles that I've personally gotten a lot out of. And just like all qual is like, it promises to be like this system, like a way of generally orienting some meta heuristics so that in the messiness of lived reality, we can like at least temporarily take a step back, make sure we're checking off some key boxes to not reduce the complexity of reality into some oversimplified way, and also to not exaggerate any one little box. And that, as we use those meta models and embody them and actually transform by applying them again and again and over time, like we start to get a facility where it becomes an auto-corrective system a little more as we go into a more stabilizing or a more maturing meta-integrative approach, not just a checklist, a map making, and like we have to check out the engineering plan again, but it's like actually how we're more like flowing with others in our bodies and minds, like in real time. But those key first principles, like at least having some of them, we don't need to have a whole suite personally, but we do if we're actually trying to meet others where they're at. Having some more tools in the toolkit, like lets us be in someone else's world and world making and world populating and world creating. It helps us meet others with a little more elegance, flexibility, nuance, that it's not in any way like exaggerating, like that any of the first principles have to be permanently real in all cases, as if reality will always be structured like this in every corner of every universe. Doesn't have to be like that. But they're at least based on some evidence that we know of, a lot of different types of evidence. Here's a handy thing to try. 1, 2, 3. Listen to it, chew it really rigorously for yourself, and try it out in your direct experience according to like other experts or people who did similar things. These are like broad empiricism that can be personally verified. Like it's good to have some basic tools, especially as like complexity increases and speeds up, and the urgency to like be under the pressure of information overload, overflow, cross-pollination like accelerates with a meta crisis, meaning crisis, culture war. Pick a thing that's emerging now. It's good to have these like first principle meta heuristics that make it really simple, but not simple and dumbed down. But like you say, I think sometimes layman, simplex, like up-leveled simplicity, not this reductionist Twitter feed, like very squeezed, extracted, unhealthy, extreme kind of like partiality. But actually it takes the kind of overflow of complex being in the world with others and like hits some pith instructions, which is Tibetan Buddhism's known for, these pith instructions that like really attune to like the lived dynamics of a given situation, who's as fully all qual as you can be, and then just says, here's the elegant through line in this case. Test it for yourself, chew on it, and then check in with lived reality and see if that pith instruction is still helpful. And if not, ask for another one or apply another one you learned. And it requires this meta adaptability, like when we actually do this up-leveled simplicity, to use things like meta heuristics or these first principles.
Yeah, I love that. I think the meta adaptability is essential because there's this constant dance between trying to really be at the center, or maybe even the spear tip of your embodied, compassionate, wise, stable existence, and getting kind of direct feedback about how that's going through your interactions, and this sense that you're never totally sure whether that includes all the relevant perspectives or not. So there you have to go
Doesn't.
aside and go, well, what's on the checklist? But you can't stay in the checklist. You have to live it in that moment. And so swaying back and forth between those is the pertinent skill set as far as I can tell. And so meta adaptability points to that for me for sure.
How flexible can we be without breaking? How open-hearted can I be without being like broken-hearted? Like how much of reality, how much of reality can I really love without being viscerally ripped apart by the tender, aching, longing heartache of just things coming and going and loved ones, coming and leaving and beautiful moments happening and dissolving. Like that, the Buddha was so clear about like the fragile nature, the poignancy of being a dependently arisen, like being a connected, embodied, embedded, breathing being that depends on others relationally, not just others humans. We can throw in a bunch of non-humans and more than humans and this world and other worlds and empirical physics and empirical chemistry, empirical astrophysics. There's all kinds of layers in each of those different sets of knowledge with its skills and like experimentation. Everything is so layered, even if we're looking at only the most obvious layers. So like to be a layered being that has emotions, that has bad habits, that has beauties and talents and tragic undoings and like an emphasis and bias, like prejudice that are healthy and harmful. Prejudice, like a meta heuristic, is like, let me highlight the things that I know are usually workable. Or an unhealthy prejudice that totally needs to given up. Like Buddhism calls that extreme view, a locking mechanism to fixate and always assume something is given without checking to see if that's true right now. Like, it's just hard. It is a hard thing to be in this together. But the reward of it is if we actually start looking, and like that's for my own self, the more I look at how it is to be embedded, how is it that this awareness is happening? How is it that it could possibly be layering or interacting with something that's not awareness, or that's another awareness, or it's some co-created artifact of awareness is interacting? Like, how does that work? How does this interdependence function? And like the beauty of like Buddha's challenge or invitation is the closer we look, the more we'll both see the relationality of how things are interactive, and also pointing towards this absolute, ultimate, unchanging, beyond all conceptual mapping isness that is this, then insert your metaphor, a field of awareness. I mean, and it's all pointing towards the moon. All the models are pointing towards the moon. But the question is, for the integrative person, is this model both in that, boundless, inexhaustible, like uncategorizable isness, and also using the most helpful, skillful, relevant modeling system right now, as widely as my aperture of now can be, like as a relationally in an accurate way as I can be, with more and more and more of a field of relational relative truth. That's kind of the fine-tuned, kind of elegant way of the Bodhisattva invitation that the Buddha offered, both on the relational side and the absolute side. How can we like carry or hold or surrender into or express through that living unity, or that dynamic, being and doing and becoming in this more thorough kind of like stable way. And I think that is a core impulse of a meta-integrative system. Like, I think at a certain point of meta-integrative system, that has to become like a very, it has to be an impulse that at a certain point, you have to care for that if you're not going to create a monstrosity of a meta-integrative Darth Vader model system.
Yeah, I'm looking at these not just Tibetan Buddhism and integral thinking, but like kind of archetypes of approaches to wisdom that are being manifested in this conversation that you're holding.
Mm.
And there's like one of the things that's very clear at the beginning of the book is a little bit of saying to your Dharma peers, like, why would we even be interested in this? Right. And you say, look, these people have this system. It's pretty up to date. It has something in common with us, which is it's very interested in the perspective we're using. And it has some tools to help us locate where the other is right now and all the different ways they can be there so that we can really meet them in the encounter. But the flip side of that is the Dharma challenge, which is, yes, okay, but are you really doing it?
100%.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing to me too, because I just came out of North Carolina and I got volunteered to host a couple of sessions. And one of them, people are like, oh, we want Layman to talk about Dharma and shamanism, or there's a kind of conjunction of things people associate with me. So they ask about it.
Uh-huh.
And when I think about these things, and I put a lot of emphasis on like the futuristic and the archaic, and I tend to downplay the traditional to some degree, even though still loving and appreciating it. And
Oh,
I think because of coming out of such a traditional modern sensibility in the West, we might have an exaggerated read on how urban and institutional something like Buddhism is, right? Because I think there is this real tension between people that have been following the same kinds of heuristics, but assuming things that we learn in ecological contexts versus people that have not as much experience as that. And they make a slightly different assumption about the same trainings.
mm,
So I think there's a danger that something is lost when we start to do it with text and with city and with monastery building that maybe
yep.
wasn't as much of an issue 20,000 years ago when people were doing this. But we
Yeah.
also exaggerate the degree to which that's the context for Buddhism. Like most of
Yep.
Buddhism was largely illiterate. Most of Buddhism was largely outside, right? It's only been a few hundred years in a way where this was a sort of more modern, more in-building kind of a scenario. So I'm curious about your sense of the relationship between Tibetan Buddhism and ecology at a deep level.
Yeah, it goes to this key polarity of preservation and innovation. We come across something that really works for us, it rings true, we're starting to taste the benefits. And naturally, like, we want to share it, or we live it, and then other people kind of connect up with it and then get curious about it if we're really, healthy and kind of, expressive of it. And over time that can, like, rigidify or get structured into buildings and, timings and sessions and schedules, and then money and real estate and books, and all of a sudden the culture and the societal structuring kind of grows upon it. One, is it preserving something of value, and is it preserving that in a healthy way or an extreme way? And then to innovate, like, is this actually relevant? Is this, the buildings we're creating and the books we're reading and the practices we're doing, like, how much is it getting actual in touch play, like healthy feedback loops with lived experience now in this case? And I think Buddhism in particular is like, it has to some degree, and, like, to say that right, Layman, Buddhism in particular, what does that mean? Like 2,000 years of, like, this, how many countries with how many people? I mean, it's like billions of people that have been through this thing. Like, and how do I know what it is for them? I have no clue. But I I do know that, like, even currently, a lot of active and probably not very literate Buddhists throughout the world, and Tibetan Buddhists, like, not very, like, weird educated, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, like, they still go out of their way to not intentionally kill a bug, right? So in terms of getting traction in relevance, like with actual practices and tools and, models, like, regardless of how conscious people are aware of the models and are aware of the institutional biases and what's been edited when, and, like, it still is a set of practices and basic ideas that gets millions of diverse people to actually try to not harm stuff, even stuff that, like, isn't like an ant, right? And for me, like, to have such a deeply emphasized omni-win approach, like where you really try to not harm others. And as much as you can, you try to help. And as much as you can, you try to actually check in with yourself, your own body, your own mind, to like do that better, more skillfully, more helpfully. Like that says a lot with the basic impulse of Buddhism, like what has been preserved for centuries, that's still a living impulse amongst old people, just, like rotating prayer wheels, and they're retired, and they just, oh, mani padme hum, mani padme hum, mani padme hum, mani padme hum, oh, and they're happy. And like a lot of these people in the Tibetan case have been through genocide. They know people that were murdered and actively tortured. Like, I mean, this is not some thing of the past for people. Like, and they're still coming and generally approaching, like so many of them I've come across, these like old Tibetans that have been through it, my teacher included. They come with love. Like their first response is love, kindness, compassion, understanding. Wow, look at how lost this person is. Look at how much destruction they're causing. Like, this is so avoidable because this person's so beautiful. Like, they have a Buddha nature. They have this intrinsic value that's like perfectly genius in every way possible. And they don't see it. Like, that's just one core, like, meta heuristic or a first principle. Like, every awareness, it's at its very most essential nature, is good and true and beautiful. It's called Buddha nature. And is that a real thing? Is that reifiable? No. It's empty too. It's not fixed. But every being has this, in that people who haven't been through school, who like basically are still agrarian, so-called feudal, kind of, they still come up with some basic meta frameworks where they're just love, 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 compassion, what's for dinner. Like they're just people, but that they have that such a thing has been preserved through so many countries, through so many centuries. And I think that's one of the big things that a lot of these meta-integrative approaches, and also just AI, caring people, are like, how do we bind this meta explosion to goodness like that? Like, how do we get it so people don't use the more powerful tech to hurt each other or just to selfishly, do the Darth Vader thing? Because like Tibetan Buddhism is an example of incredibly powerful tech. When you're talking about chakra systems and clairaudience and clairvoyance, all these kind of like extra human natural capacities turn on, and still people don't try to step on the ant. Like at the most obvious layer too, not just the subtle interdimensional layer, but the most obvious layer, like how can I show up more kindly with you now in a helpful way, where afterwards, if someone asked you, hey, how'd the meeting go? How was the time? What's Dragpa like? They're like, Dragpa's fucking awesome. Like, it was sweet, Or, I don't know, this isn't so good. He said this thing, and then how available am I to receive that feedback? That'll show you about the health of an institutional setup, which also can just be my sense of me over time. Like, I'm a totally a reified institution. It's called the body mind complex of Dragpa. I'm really trying to preserve this thing. But if I preserve it in an extreme way and say, I am this, and this is the way I have to be, and I'm unchanging in such and such ways, and I refuse to take other perspectives beyond certain point, otherwise I'm going to start to fight. That's where I need some other people to put me in check, to give me healthy feedback. That's where I need to have tools myself, where I can see when I'm doing that a little more actively. And that's where I just need to have some humility to be like, I'm a part, like, this is like really, people have gone very, very far and deep into applying these methods and these worldviews, like way further than I've gone. And like, am I open to actually like glean some of the nuggets of their lived experience, where I don't have to remake every wheel just because like it'll be my wheel, but like it's still going to be my wheel, but I can like be intelligent about like where I put my time and energy, and I can like really try some like things that have been preserved, and they demonstrate a mutual, win-win, like I won't step on the ant kind of thing. And they'll also be flexible to be like, oh, there's a lot of ways to care for beings. Which modality is helpful? Which therapeutic modality? Which way of languaging something? I'm meeting you now, Layman. I like your explosive, creative, trickster, ontological flood the zone approach. So I'm like, I'll play with that. Like, this is not a like intro to integral conversation. This is like, let's have fun. But this dynamic of preserve and innovate is so key, exactly what you brought up. And it always has to be key if something's going to keep being relevant and not just a dogma.
Yeah, there's a beautiful complementarity and creative tension there. I'd be curious to probe a little bit more about how you hold that, because there is this the gift of the insightful of the past, and the fact that the circumstance we're in continues to change and therefore requires new adaptations. And then to some degree, the background of all that change is unchanging, but then might change in certain interesting ways. And getting a system set up where there's a transmissible to our future selves and to our children and to the people of tomorrow, a system whereby a robust minimum of the best of our inheritance allows us to not have to regenerate everything ourselves at each turn, but also enables enough interest in and encouragement for rediscovery and innovation that the Dharma is constantly watered and adapted to the moment and to the culture and to the kinds of people and challenges that arise. And it relates a little bit, you mentioned sort of this issue of meeting people that maybe a model like Integral is very good at framing, and then this need to recognize the mysterious isness that's at the heart and in the surround and in the in-betweens of all those interactions. And a lot of people who we might say are very simple seem to have this ability to get an instruction and then take on a habit of just being caring. And then there's other people who that's much more difficult for them. They can't trust it that way as much. They have to go in and rediscover it themselves and conclude the isness from out of the encounter, while these other people can just bring the isness in as a standard practice that they hold in addition to the encounter. So like this, that's a fascinating area for me. I'm curious how you personally hold that.
Yeah, there's a saying that I heard directly from my teacher, Venerable Khenpo Tsewang Dongyal Rinpoche. He said there's a saying in Tibet that there's basically two types of people. People who are like kind of very loyal and committed, but a little slow. And then people that are like really clever and adept and like very kind of like sharp, but very distrusting. So you can call this like the stubborn, committed, loyal people, and then the clever skeptics. And my teacher Rinpoche said, if it's an either or situation, if it's that way and you can only be one or the other, it's better to be stubborn and committed to something that works than to be clever and basically you spend all your time and maybe you'll get to something that works, but maybe you won't. But the both and is the best is to be both stubborn and committed and very discerning. Like to really, that's where in Buddhism it has this kind of dual perspective of using concepts well so you can have very clear discernment to recognize what is non-conceptual or post-conceptual, what is the beingness, and then from that recognition of actual uncategorized post-conceptual beingness, you can creatively express with discernment the living body structures and kind of modeling communications like that actually hold that isness or that being. So so that's called study and practice, the union of study and practice. You refine your concepts by hearing, hey, try this out. You try it out. You get a taste of it with deduction, induction, abduction, direct experience. Like you get some robust kind of sense of verification. You test that with others. Eventually, as you keep doing that, that transforms how you interpret, how you're doing, and also in your lived experience, like how you are. And then that gets you into like this more uncategorized or post-conceptual wisdom mode, where you're not funneling through any modeled system as if the modeled system is reality, but you're actually like pointing towards reality and then being in it. And then from that post-conceptual way of being called meditation or meditative, like a wisdom, then you can like express that through, relational structures like words, body movements. And so there's like the union is always kind of like the through line we're trying to thread. Like in Buddhism, use concepts well, but because we are ourselves like egoic, me first tendencies always want to latch on to something and repurpose it to demonstrate how I'm so awesome. I'm the center of the world. And that's why these suites of ecologies are so key, both different ways of studying and different ways of practicing. So we basically get this, for example, an eightfold noble path, which is like, for right livelihood, right intention, right view, right speech, right mindfulness, like these, for example. And like in the Vervaekian sense, they are counteractively, dynamically always checking each other. And in Buddhism, that's just called a practice based on personal investigation. And that investigation is the most outer stuff, which is typically we look at the world and try to figure out its patterns. And the more inner stuff, we look at our own minds and try to figure out its patterns. And we look at the in-between stuff, the inner subjective or inner objective, that layer of liminal interactivity. What are the relational patterns going on there? But because if we're operating through an egoic me first mode, that's always going to privilege a bunch of stuff and not really be meta-integrative, but just be like assuming I'm right. But if we actually try it out, recognize what's happening, and then try to reintegrate in a way of being, a being mode, like an actual post-conceptual, uncategorized isness mode of called absolute truth or whatever we call it, that'll feed back into better study. So study will enhance the practice and practice will enhance the study. And that's like the ideal we're trying to kind of align through as like, it's called scholar practitioners in Buddhism. But the problem is with a lot of people now, like I don't have enough time to deep dive into the scholastic tradition, because in Tibetan Buddhism, that's like an 8 or 9 year program for Nyingmas, or in Gelugpa New School, that's about a 15, 20 year program of just studying, just refining concepts only on the sutra level, not even anything to do with Tantra yet. So I'm not doing that. I don't have the time, right? I probably don't have the talent either. But on the opposite side, the practice side, the standard minimal, like actual practice engagement in a Tibetan Buddhist model system is a 3-year, 3-month, 3-week, kind of 3-day immersive retreat. So most people don't have the time for that either. And I don't. And that's like basic. That's like where you start to get a sense of what is your mind doing, because you hold yourself and you constrain the kind of like you incubate. You get a PhD in meditation, but that's like the low level PhD until you expand it. And so I'm not doing the deep dive into either of those. So it comes back to where we kind of started is these first principles. How can I know what's a reliable pith instruction? Like a reliable working model, at least the essential things. And that's what I really deeply appreciate about, as one example of a meta-integraler like Ken Wilber, this all qual, all states, all types, all levels, all lines, and then also probably all polarities and all shadows. Like, it's like, how do we get some orienting generalizations that have proven they're actually really helpful buckets of reality to not forget about? And then we just toggle in, like queue up, and see where it goes, all the while being very, very open to the fact that we might be significantly not lining up with a lot of reality too, that we just haven't yet kind of become aware of.
That's where we have to rely on other people, right? Whether those people are adept mentors or whether they're just the sort of extended networks of other people who are in the same position of circulating through ecologies of practice and drawing on whatever degree of assimilation and discernment they have relative to different sets of traditions and running those things past each other. Because, like you say, we just don't have the time to do it ourselves, but we can't perfectly commit to something either because we haven't verified it for ourselves, but we're not alone in this endeavor.
We're definitely not. And I mean, I'm cautioning here, like, I like the exploratory play and just like go into abstract land. And this is actually related to a bunch of scriptures and a bunch of practices. And we're kind of doing high level talk, especially me, like maybe it's too much, but it comes down to these really core principles, like recognize and give up bad habits, recognize and practice good habits, and then recognize what's non-habituated, what's natural. Like they say, this is all the Buddha's teachings. Like, don't do bad stuff, do good stuff, recognize your natural goodness. There's different ways to frame this, but basically it's like lessen negative grasping, increase positive grasping, recognize non-grasping wisdom. So the whole path is actually said to be merit and wisdom. Merit is called conceptual, helpful, positive grasping. So good grasping. Wisdom is non-grasping or naturalness. And that's said to be the whole path. But the fact is, and this is like the healthy postmodern thing that's been emphasized so strongly now in like more kind of so-called weird contexts, or like the age of reason, European-based kind of explosion of industrialization and all, is like that for those good habits or bad habits, that's always contextual. Like it always depends, right? What's good for me, helpful for me, it could be really harmful for you. You know, me drinking. I mean, it's just there's so many examples of that. So then we have to be like, in this context with me, what's helping and what's not? What's helping and not with you? Where's that meeting? Like, what's the wiggle room? Which means like a healthy meta-integrative anything is always going to have that healthy postmodern contextualization, like perspective, like perspectival, multi-perspectival, multicultural, like the embeddedness of being relationally like relevant. Like it's always going to have that component. Like as one feature, it also has to have the healthy modern like testability and verification and, you know, show me the money stuff. And it has to have the healthy pre-modern, like, is this gonna, you know, stand the test of time and like not have to reinvent the wheel every time and give basic human belonging, you know, meaning making, security and, you know, rejoicing and I mean, it's just all these things that so many integralers of various types have explored. We need to also learn how to get these into the simple, testable techniques. Give up bad habits, do good habits, be natural, and check to see if that's working for you right now in the way that's relevant to your lived experience. And if you care about it, which a healthy meta-integraler would, is it helping others too? The beings I depend on, like the beings that I'm completely like in communication with all the time. So is it omni-win? And that's where it gets
and is it helping over diverse scales of time? Right. Because
exactly.
I think one of the discussions around shadow is that a lot of things that seem in the short term like they're totally working for you and maybe working for somebody else too might sabotage you at some future point.
Exactly. Yep. And so how do you do that? Like, how do you have a shadow, you know, a shadow identifier system? So you can look at general historical trends, and you can look at a third party person outside of the shared community. And you can, there's a lot of stuff you can study. What do you think? What have you found, Layman, to like help, you know, pop the bubble of, you know, exclusive insider cult making?
I mean, I think the main thing I rely on is high trust sub networks within very informed communities. So like it's going to bounce around between people, and you're going to get these reflective hits that you might not find on your own. But you're only going to be able to take them in if you're actually developing some kind of intimacy with those people, learning to count on them in practical ways. And then the other thing that strikes me a lot is this strategy of inversion, like the 3-2-1 part, or you know, any kind of the basic 20th century shadow work perspectives where you exploratorily, without investing too much time and energy at it, but just try out and see whether you actually hold the opposite energy or the opposite perspective before moving on from a situation. That seems to do a lot of heavy lifting.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, those inversion modes are so nice. I mean, often now in like a lot of more conversational frames, I come up as like straw manning, steel manning, uh, platinum manning, or platinum humaning, to like actually take an inhabited a really good faith dynamic. How do you create a good faith dynamic? Not just to like represent someone faithfully where they would like enthusiastically agree, but test it out, like live that for a bit, like actually do the what if this was what I believed in, and like really try to add a more core level, like give it the benefit of the doubt and see what imaginal out of the box surprise happens. Both the goods and the bads, like, and to really kind of test it out and like in with practice. And I think and with the Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhist leanings, I think it's much less exploratory in that kind of a way, because there's a lot of ways that cannot work out. Like it's just like we can do a bunch of test cases of a lot of iterations and kind of see which one evolutionarily sticks over long spans of time scales. But like most of it won't stick, like because most mutations don't get taken up in the longer course of the arc of time and body. And so Vajrayana in general and Buddhism more general is like pretty conservative over like to do test case challenges like that. It's more just like stick with kind of what's been known, and that can get dogmatic if people aren't really testing it out in their experience, and they're not willing to look at new evidence, or they're not willing to test something out because they feel threatened because by the newness or the novelty, or maybe we'll lose this thing. And so that's always a tendency with anything that's lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. And then but to not do that, to get knee-jerk reactive, shadow projective, and immediately lock up when something novel or new or different or emergent's happening, then of course that's like we're trying to avoid that. And that's the very question, like how do we avoid it when it can be very cozy to just chill out in our zone, or to not deal with the projections we're like pouring everywhere, but don't want to take responsibility for, kind of like change our ways with the transformational work that is required of that. It's usually all this stuff, to just be straight up and real, all this stuff is really very fear inspiring, because it involves some kind of death. I'm going to die to this habit, die to this way of being, of shaping, of moving, of loving, of grieving, like to hold more like with honor, to like actually meet someone where they're at and try to really viscerally kind of more inhabit that with healthy boundaries, but to really like give it like a really deeply resonant, opportunity. There's definitely going to be some stuff that dies. And that's very, hard.
I'm very curious about the way you hold what Vajrayana is. There's a lot of talk about wheels and turnings, and there's a tendency in any lineage to want to affirm the amount of wisdom that was already present from the very beginning. But what does Padmasambhava bring in that isn't already brought in by Siddhartha and Nagarjuna?
Yeah, lovely. So, and this goes more into the more subtle aspects of relative truth, and also kind of some of this unchanging absolute truth. So more technically, according to like the lineage tradition, it's said in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddha said, 8 years from now, 8 lunar years from now, I'll come back. My name will be Guru Pema Junye. I'll be more enlightened than I am now. And so he was like, saying that he was going to come back, and like later, as Tibetan Buddhism interprets that, like as the Buddha was going to kind of re-emanate as Padmasambhava, and then different masters like His Holiness 17th Karmapa. He says there's basically 4 or so ways that the Buddha is, like Guru Rinpoche or Guru Padmasambhava, is considered more enlightened than the Buddha, who is omniscient. Like they say, technically, there's no bigger enlightenment than possible than Buddha Shakyamuni. That's like a very technical claim. So Guru Rinpoche was just self-emanated. It didn't come from like biological parents, just self-emanated, like as an 8-year-old boy in the sky on a lotus, surrounded by dakinis, with a resonance of cosmic isness happening as the Vajraguru mantra. So he didn't require like biological parents. He emphasized the tantra, or the more subtle or esoteric aspects of the teachings of the Buddha, So that's 2. He shared those in a wider range, like with more beings than the Buddha did, like into other countries. That's 3. By kind of overcoming negative, more egocentric or like kind of ethnocentric kind of ways of like kind of wanting to put a stop to that. And then 4, like when he passed away or like kind of dissolved, like he didn't leave like a flesh body. So he said to just like, spontaneously disappeared. And even that was, the story is said to be different according to different people who were at the event. So here we get into Vajrayana ontology and epistemology and methodology. And this is like the really awesome, weird flex flow stuff that's like actual bedrock Vajrayana stuff. It's like, how willing am I like to use all the scholastic training I could possibly use to go outside of all those boxes? So they say in the beginning for Buddhists, in the beginning, the most important thing to rely on in the beginning is logic, verification. But as you keep going on the path, the biggest obstacle to your continuing into kind of a path of liberation is logic. So we need to like be really aware of like when a model's working and when a model's not. Like, and part of when it's not is like when it starts to get really out of the box with kind of, the belief that someone could self-emanate as an 8-year-old boy. I mean, Guru Padmasambhava, you know how old he was said to be when he went to Tibet? So he's like, according to Buddha's teaching, he self-emanated 4 Gregorian years after he passed away. So that's 600 BCE-ish. And then he went to Tibet in the 8th century. So Guru Padmasambhava is somewhat like, 1400 years old or so when he brought the teachings of Buddhism, of the Buddha, into Tibet. So this is the exoteric. This is the most outer depiction of this kind of happening, which a lot of people would just be like, this is myth, This is like a story, total fictional storytelling. And so that's one perspective. It usually aligns with a lot of modernity and empirical science and metaphysical realism. You got to like Wilberian eye of flesh, eye of mind logic. So you got to see it with your 5 sense doors to believe it. And if you don't see it, like past lives, future lives, and all these clairaudience and stuff, it's probably not there. And pretty much it's not there because institutions have claimed that stuff forever and they've used it to take advantage of other people. Like, so there's the human history of bad people doing that stuff. But the point is, how intelligently can I suspend disbelief to give something that's really outside of my box a fair shake? And that's where like people like Sean S. Bjorn Hargens, and I mean, as one, like in meta-integral circles, like he's like down with the exo exploration, Andrew Holacek and others. And Vajrayana, this is like the entry door. Like if we're not willing to suspend disbelief in certain ways of like the Buddha said to like, he taught, where was Vajrayana even taught initially by the Buddha Shakyamuni? He said to teach it in celestial realms to invisible beings. That's like exoteric Vajrayana origin story. So if we're not willing to kind of go there, then all of a sudden that, it shows like our what ontologies we're willing to entertain and what we're not. And that's not to say, there's still not a lot that we could get out of something like Tibetan Buddhism or something that's so richly esoteric and ontologically plural. But there's going to be some pretty strong limits on like how we can like take seriously what these succession of lineage masters for hundreds of years, what they claim versus what we would agree to now, over the last 100 years. And you get these versions of like, secular Buddhists, or like it, has to be tangibly demonstratable or otherwise I won't believe it. And so there's a real conversation there that's active amongst Buddhists. So yeah, and I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to be a being in the world. Like I am very much appreciative of ontological pluralism, epistemological pluralism, methodological pluralism. There's a lot of ways to know and to be and to methodologically engage. Like, and so I'm up for that. And I think Vajrayana is very up for that. But it's not that we all have to be up for that. We can be comfortable with the parts that are comfortable for us. And as long as when we suspend disbelief, or when we say, oh, this is what's really real, we hold that really lightly. Because if we're good scientists, what's really real is just based on what we know so far. And like, if we don't allow the working model of our ontology, epistemology, and methodology to keep getting in data, then we become a scientism, of whatever variety you have. And Buddhists can do that too.
Yeah, I love my sense of Vajrayana as having a really rich palette, right? It's like it's got 64 crayons in the crayon box rather than just 12, right? And whether we think that comes from the avataric descent of the master, or whether we tell interesting stories about how Buddhism merges with hill shamanism to really bring forward practices that have esoteric flavors and imaginal capacities and the affects of magic. Well, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but what I really appreciate is there is this set of additional options that are made really salient in that tradition. And maybe they're imaginal beings, maybe they're anomalous beings who don't respect our categories of reality, maybe they're from other worlds, whatever they are, maybe it's an elaborate extended version of psychological pluralism, whatever the case is. There's tools and stories there that invite us to play in those zones. And that's balanced in a really interesting way by this kind of cultural conservatism within Vajrayana that maybe helps hold that all together, because that stuff on its own, and once in a while when I'm with Sean, I think, whoa, we got to rein this in a little bit.
He says he has a basic thing he remembers: take it seriously, but hold it lightly. Test something out, but it's like, okay, this is maybe one way. There's probably another, probably three others, probably a lot of others. So take it seriously, but hold it lightly. Don't immediately casually dismiss something, because that really points towards dogmatism, an unwillingness to adapt. But also don't be so open-minded your brain falls out. We're like, okay, fine, it's all just numbers, or it's all just colors, or it's all just sounds. Like, we need to test this thing as rigorously as we can, with as many ways we can, as all quality as we can, as meta-integratively as we can. That's where he says all this kind of the topic of UFOs, or in Buddhism, the topic of the six realms. That's like in the most exoteric Theravada foundational Buddhism system. Hell beings, hungry ghost beings, animals, humans, warring gods, other kinds of gods, many types of classes of gods with different lifespans and body types and things they're good at and all that stuff. Like, how willing and able are we really to like creatively suspend disbelief and then try something out? And the cool thing is with Tibetan Buddhism is there's actual practices we can do to try it out. Like, do the test drive. Like, for example, like a basic like guru yoga practice is like, first off, we try to recognize our own, it's called Rigpa, or our own like wisdom awareness right now. From that, we naturally extend it to like pervasively include every single being in every single corner of reality. And then with that absolute kind of isness, with this actual relational kind of like extended compassionate kind of like spark, it starts to take shape as sound and syllable and body. And then so we arise as a body, as this imaginal being with an imaginal other and an imaginal surrounding entourage or retinue, so others, in a world system like that actually is this pure world, pure other, pure self. So this is like bread and butter tantra, like pure body, pure speech, pure mind. Pure body is called deity. Pure speech is called mantra. Pure mind is called dharmakaya. That is like the playground of an imaginal practice that's like a basic bread and butter practice in Tibetan Buddhism. And so then recognizing Rigpa, allowing infinite compassion to arise, taking shape, the union of being and doing, like as this pure mode of pure body, pure speech, pure mind, we try that out. And during a practice, we would, okay, can I be as big as a galaxy? Can I be as tiny as a mustard seed? Can I be two people simultaneously? Can I be blue with 8 arms? Can I dissolve into a spot of a single sphere? Can I like then dissolve into like total formless unmanifested isness? Like, and this is like just a very typical Tibetan Buddhist practice where we're actually taking on these different perspectives in this embodied, like really try it out kind of a way where we're really trying to be it without doubting it as we test it. We're trying to suspend the study and the skepticism for after the practice. During the practice, let yourself really fill it out and inhabit it. And then we see what your heart does, see what your mind does, see what your creativity is, see if your discernment sharpens or gets more vague. But there's so many sets of actual ecologies of practices where we can do that. And it's according to people's typology and body structure, like what chakra do you want to work on? What kind of ability are you trying to like, hone in order to be more helpful in a certain situation? Like, it's this, like Tibetan Buddhism can be lived in so many ways by so many bodies at so many times, depending on what's more relevant for the actual being who's testing it out. Even if that being is a Gandharva or a Kimnara or a hell being or a hungry ghost, it doesn't have to be human centric in the Tibetan Buddhist worldview or in the Buddhist worldview at all. Of course, I'm like identified with my humanness. And so that's where I start. And these Buddhas tend to like take the shape of a human being, basically because if, from my perspective, if a Buddha took the shape of a giant 8-foot tall, like blue triangle that started shooting fire at me, like I'd freak out. Like, so he shows up as like a lovely 16-year-old woman who's like inviting and kind and like pervading with compassion and like asking me to like also like shine on my compassion now too. It's just skillful. It's just like a helpful method. And then the question of like, well, is that ontologically real? Meaning, is there actually a place in space-time or some even non-space-time, some kind of mode of being that doesn't assume those kind of conceptual categories? Is that actually a there? In Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism said, yeah, there's tons of theirs. There's so many of them. But the relevant question is like, in my lived experience now, with like how I'm relating with the others that I can see and interact with, like what are helpful methods and ontologies and also epistemologies, ways of knowing that actually help that be better? And that you'd ask the people, they say yes. And like later, hopefully, like you ask other third-party people and they're like, yeah, that was really helpful.
The two things that interest me in all of this very much are um, conversational heuristics, I think, are an issue, which is to say how we talk to each other about this makes a difference. And concepts like sincere irony and metamodern spirituality, or like I like to point to Trungpa Rinpoche's use of the word seems as just a really ultra simple way of taking something out of the category of we're going to argue about its ontology and just start exchanging about the phenomenology and what the consequences were. So I think there is a we need to evolve and retrieve some good conversational heuristics. And then there's this disposition to taking risks at the edge of the ontology we currently understand ourselves to hold. And like with any risk taking, you have to be safe enough, supported enough, practiced enough to take that risk. But I hear in a lot of what you're saying, a positive attitudinal disposition toward risk taking, whether that's the risk of heartbreak or whether that's the risk of the chasm of ontological pluralism that might initially seem daunting, but actually is full of luminosity once you go into it, or the risk of really leaning into a practice that might challenge your assumptions about reality consists of. Right? There's an emotional reticence on the part of a lot of rationally competent people to allow themselves to take the participatory risk of challenging the boundary of what's rationally included. But I think we don't keep composting and expanding our map unless we're willing to take those experiential forays into territories that might initially seem negative for one reason or another. And for me, a lot of that is often internal conflict is a territory we don't really lean into very much. right? Even if we go, hey, I used to believe this, so then I had this experience, and now I have to decide which one. I'm like, yeah, there's something in there about weighing and crafting hybrids, but there's also something about bearing up under the indeterminacy of having access to things that might be best interpreted through contradictory modalities. And that's one of the really interesting, seemingly negative things that I find is just full of a smoothness and delight if you actually give yourself over to the efforts.
Thus have I heard. All the sutras are saying that. They're not saying this is the 100% truth. They're like, I don't know, this is what I heard. I might be wrong. Right? It has a disposition towards open-mindedness, towards please check me, toward like it. So that's a healthy stance right from the beginning. Two, like my more disposition towards like risk, or kind of like, ooh, having my worldview, my kind of world spacing a little threatened or stretched or tested. I mean, I think I have just the tremendous, extraordinary, tremendous fortune of being a student of like Venerable Khenchen, Palden, Sherab Rinpoche, Venerable Khenpo Tsewang Dongyal Rinpoche, who by any metric I've come up with in the 21 or so years I've been more closely around them and in their mandala, their sacred kind of worlding space of their different communities they have and the people that come through, like they are actually have demonstrated like bodhisattvas who believe in bodhicitta, and bodhicitta, the union of wisdom and compassion. This is for all beings to be happy and free of suffering and the causes of suffering. Like that is the through line that like they've demonstrated time and time again as like this is a possible way of being that's on all the time. And we can get as like ontologically, epistemologically, methodologically as vast and profound as we want to get, but the bedrock is always the heart mind of enlightenment. It's always omni-win. And this is where I think it's very relevant for meta-integrative approaches of any type. Like, I think this is like one of the key points, if not necessary points, is to like have a hard fork here. There's going to be the meta-integrative approaches that don't take omni-win seriously and become exceptionally dangerous. And there's going to be the meta-integrative approaches that always hold themselves accountable to omni-win only, to what Buddhism calls bodhicitta. And this is sutra level, like Buddhism. Like in Vajrayana, if you don't start with a foundation of bodhicitta, the union of relative and absolute bodhicitta, emptiness and compassion, if you don't start with that as the lived thing you start with, within every practice is called the noble beginning. That's always what you're supposed to turn on. Every different Vajrayana practice, that's right at the front and center of the beginning, called noble beginning, this bodhicitta. If you don't turn that on, you're trespassing. You're going to use the tech or the enlightened suite of ecologies of like being and knowing and becoming and doing. You're going to use it wrong. What does that mean? For selfish or self-centered purposes. And like that becomes what's called Rudra, or Darth Vader's, like the common, like colloquial instance of that. If you don't intentionally bind yourself to wisdom and compassion as best as you can, and be willing to see when that's not happening, and like to try to increase that muscle, that capacity, that knowing, that being quality, like that's the through line. And I just happen to have studied, and I'm still studying with under them, both of them, like the Venerable Khenpo Rinpoches, they're called. And that's given me like a very, very solid, like super fortunate ground to be willing to be stretched, to be tested, to like consider things way out of my current box, because it always has to be bodhicitta aligned. And that's emphasized again and again and again at the beginning of every Tibetan Buddhist exploration, whether it's a study or a practice. Every time that's the beginning, it holds itself to an omni-win worldview perspective, or a view, which means it locks Tantra. The heart always has to be sutra. And because of that, I can rely on it. I can test it. I can like give the benefit of the doubt to allow the transformative overflow of, I have no clue what this is and what's happening, but I can turn bodhicitta on as a lived experience in the tiny way that I can, but you can conceptually understand it and post-conceptually be it. Like a little bit I can do. And that's what holds it as a reliable, trustworthy set of ecologies. And I think that, and like in any integrative space I'm a part of, whether it is Gebserian or Game B or Metamodern or Wilberian Integral or Exo Studies or UTOK, like that's always the point I emphasize most. Because that's something we can turn on right now as a lived experience that doesn't require a lot of study, doesn't require a lot of practice. It's not some really heady thing. It's like a lived something we can taste and see the mutual benefit, like both for ourselves and others we're around. And if we turn that on again and again and again, it's going to severely reduce the risk of making bad decisions and creating, engineering all kinds of amazingly intricate, complex stuff that's just better off not having been created, because it like was basically a detour that like, you know, caused a bunch of suffering down the line.
It also has the benefit of having strong objective markers, right? That there are ways of looking at the being that suggest when interorganismic or mutually sensitized neurocardial coherence is activated in an organism. And you can put that on a scan and point at it in a very clear and straightforward kind of way.
Yep.
I don't know how you're doing for time.
So
Do we need to end this or whatever else you want to talk about? I just wanted to say I'm open here.
Hey, cool. I'm open here too, like Layman, sorry. Yeah. That's a big point you just made, Layman. This is not just some take my word for it stuff. This like you can do the fMRI scans on these meditators. You can put Matthew Ricard in a thing and he generates compassion, and like you can see what do his brainwaves do, or what are they advocating for in their philosophy? Like, is it showing up in their, like, how they run a community? How do they handle money? Like, how are they equal with the different people that come to them asking for help? Like, these are all very tangible metrics we can assess. Like, the thing about a lineage is like, and this is one of the beautiful things that I found in my experience that's like a really something relevant, I think, for a lot of people who are in integral or integrative mapping, is like part of like a lot of where the benefit and like the integrity of these kind of maps in real life happens is when you actually hold yourself in time, in place for long enough. Because some of these relational dynamics and this testing only happen. The experiment is our lives in a community with other people. Like, that's where we get the data. And if we just kind of only think of metamap level, or we only, try this, try that, like we'll basically, like, certain experiments or certain kinds of data that they might reveal won't be available to us. It'll just be hearsay, like someone else said it worked in their community. And this doesn't have to be a Buddhist community or some kind of spiritual aligned community, but we do have, like Tyson Yunkaporta, we do have to locate this in embodied space and time. Like, it's not just abstract theorizing, it's not just, so that means also in Buddhism, we can prevent the thing of like, I show up with everything I believe in. I go into the, interesting thing that's like foreign to me. I take the one little select technique out of it, like mindfulness, and then I plug and play it in my given reality and like get some benefit. Like that basic colonial move we all know, like as healthy postmodern informed people, like that is a no-no, like you can't just go in and grab the thing and act as if it's the full integrity of what that was in contextual embodiment. So the point here that I'm making is like, to some degree, we do have to show up in time and space with other people who are curiously engaging these same kind of worldviews and the tech or the embodied kind of relational transformative practice that they like point towards and kind of demand in a lot of cases. And we have to give it enough time. And that's a big deal. Like that means we do have to take the risk of creating some culture together and some structure together. And then that means after the fact, which I think John Churchill is pointing towards, like another Buddhist friendly kind of person, is that, the age of kind of these trailblazing integralists like Ken Wilber, or like these giants who like really just meta synthetically like integrated so much stuff, Now it's going into like, seems like a more of a phase of like teamwork. All right, the scouts have been out, different people have tried different things for decades. Report back. What have you found? Let's like test each other and check it out, because now is more an age of like Avengers team as opposed to like the single hero or heroine. Like with multi-perspective overflow of meta crises, like this is, if we're gonna respond anywhere near adequately, this is a team effort. This is a cooperative thing. This is like a lot of threads coming together to make a strong enough cord that will like hold the tension of this much dynamic interfacing at once. And that's like, how do we learn that? But being with others and like learning how to do the juicy cooperative thing. Like, and that doesn't mean be exclusive about it or get cultish about it or add all the other pre-integral, like my way is the only way and the best way and all that stuff that we need to not do. But we can really like, we need to test it out in our lives, in our relationships, in our bodies over time and see what works and what doesn't. Like, that's a strong point, don't you think?
Yeah, my thinking has increasingly gone towards hives and fields of various kinds, and giving them the support, and also, like you were mentioning, the time they need to unfold, because there may be functions of which, say, an intersubjective field is capable that won't be realized in an afternoon, might not be realized in a week, might take multiple iterations.
Yep.
And it's a participatory skill set that, as people get better in it, it starts to do a lot of the cleaning up and growing up and shadow work functions. But it also has to, I think, really take a strong look at how it holds people in the field who might otherwise be the people who would have tried to do this on their own in a previous age. Whether that's because of some kind of nervous system typology they just happen to have, whether it's because of the adept level of development or just because of their personal flavor. There's a lot of room for verticality still in there. And initially, we have to draw back from that a little bit to make sure that everybody's being held reasonably well, and we're not over crediting people that stand up as having various kinds of capacity or leadership. But then there's the question of, how do those people really fit into this whole thing as organs to help move this forward? I'm hearing a lot of discussion around that lately.
Lovely. I mean, lovely that it's getting a little more like front and center attention. Because there's, I mean, if integral points to anything, it's just the multiplicity of it. Are we the extrovert or the introvert? Like which Enneagram modality, like which level, which layer, which state, which thread, which way do we want to dance? Do we not want to dance? Do we like the quiet? Do we like the verbal? And these are all ways of being that are on the table. And so yeah, definitely a willingness to try out different things. Always that's the thing with a lot of this kind of deep dive, like exploration in response to actual real world challenge, like stuff we need to show up with. Like there needs to be enough of a common ground at the outset, like enough of a shared page, like enough of the example of a game, tennis. We need to agree to the basic rules of tennis before we start playing. Like once we start the game, it's totally arbitrary, completely made up, a total myth or a fiction. But once you accept the myth, it's the shared common reality. Like there's definitely better and worse tennis players, and there's definitely in and out of bounds, and there's frameworks and timing, and there's do's and don'ts, all kinds of things, whether they're like more ethical, moral values, or kind of very specific empirical things. And it's all arbitrary. It's all made up. But in the meantime of actually playing that game and having good faith dynamics in that game, like you can't change the rules of the game mid-game. That's just good faith. And we have to be willing to okay, let's play tennis, and you're not up for tennis. What do you want to play later? Oh, you're into croquet. All right, let's play some croquet. Oh, you're like origami. Oh, you like to do 1 hour silent, sits. All right, those are all games. Those are all just arbitrary, formal structures or language sets or whatever. we temporarily, arbitrarily agree to be healthy, like interactive, good faith participants of. Try it out, have some fun, have some laughs, actually, get upset and do the whole messiness of human togetherness. And then the game resolves, and then we play another game together. So this is also like an indication of like healthy postmodernism or contextualization. Like, and Vajrayana has all these internested sets of games. It's also often called vehicles or yanas. And it's just where we temporarily hold a certain view. We like actually apply certain meditative, practices within that world framing view. Then we try to integrate that into behavior or conduct in our life situation, not just in a formal setting, but in an informal living setting. And then we see the fruition of the result. We get the data from doing those things. All of that's arbitrary from a Buddhist view. Like, because a Buddhist view says there's no final fixed pattern of reality. And so the easy way to say that is there's no such thing as a truly existent entity, whether it's imaginal, mental, physical, co-created, plural or singular, big or small. Like the idea of there being something permanently frozen in time and space, forever, unchangeable. Buddhism, like at the very outset, refutes that. That's like a defining characteristic of all Buddhist things, which is just to say in more postmodern terms, it's all like a game. But that doesn't mean do the nihilist thing and just do whatever you want or don't take it seriously or try to cheat, because it always says it's all a game or a dream. So show up in the dream as a dream being with other dream beings in the best way possible for the most dream beings to have the most fun possible for as long as possible. And then tune in. Oh, the dream's shifting, the game's changing. Okay, pause, new game. All right, let's do this dream well. So like the kind of key takeaway here for me is like, make the dream the best dream possible for as many dream beings as you can, always remembering it's just a dream. And this avoids both in Buddhism, like getting hyper fixated on one kind of position or entity or belief structure called eternalism, like some kind of, it has to be real. And the opposite, there's nothing that's real. It's all arbitrary. Anything goes, like that extreme of nihilism. And so this kind of like does the fine tuning. And I'm not saying anything like that I'm making up. This is just standard Buddhist stuff of like honoring the relative and absolute aspects of any experience of reality, like elegantly.
Yeah, I think Buddhism has, or at least some of my favorite Buddhists, have a pretty good skill set on how to navigate relativistic cosmology. And that's something a lot of other people are stuck on. And it seems to have to do with, like you're saying, and I think there's one of the things actually Jordan Peterson articulates really well, right? There's the heuristics or like the meta level normative virtues that we're looking for, the ones that allow you to play multiple games iterated over longer periods of time. That's important.
Yep.
The confession of love is important to this because let's play tennis. Well, who cares? That's an arbitrary construct, but it's not the same as when you go, you know what? I love tennis, and let me tell you why. And someone else goes, I love tennis too. Now it's got this undergirded quality to it that's takes it to a whole different level.
Mm. Or a little kid.
Yeah.
I love Santa Claus.
Exactly.
All right, I'll play Santa Claus game with you. Awesome, like that works. Oh, I hate Santa Claus. Okay, I'll play the I hate Santa Claus game with you. And Buddhism just calls this a bodhisattva approach. They're not like
the emotional component of the delight and the trust and the belonging that creates, coupled with there's an intellectual move which realizes that one wasn't really being as relativistic as one could have been, because one was still secretly comparing relativism to the feeling of the non-relativistic and finding it to be wanting. Like a lot of what we call nihilism is like, or I've had this discussion with some Buddhists where they go, yeah, it's not that there's no soul or God in Buddhism. It's that those things are temporary relativistic constructs the same as your leg is, or a rock, right? It's a shared order of reality through unreality. It's not that there's all these real things, and there's these stupid abstractions that don't mean anything, and those we should deconstruct. They're all deconstructed at the same level. So to say it has no fixed, static, enduring, particular essence is to say that it's as real as everything else, right? And so there's a mental lock where people get into comparing relativism to non-relativism without realizing they're doing it. But if they really extend and decontract the relativity, they end up in a situation where to be, in quotation marks, is what it means to be.
Exactly. And so it goes to that root fear of like, there has to be some ground in order for this thing to be happening. There's got to be some core, some ground, some root framework. Myth of the given, myth of the framework. There has to be some bedrock, insert whatever you want to believe in, a principle, a mathematical computational equation. Whichever part of your cosmic address holds itself as being an unquestionable truth, the fear of losing that, and then what happens? That's such a bedrock core fear. And there's so many layers of that fear, which is why meditation is like a very much like self-honesty, self-other honesty, kind of like participatory challenge. Like, how willing am I to actually allow for that openness, the kind of multiplex, the like flex flow kind of like interdependence of reality? How willing am I to actually lean into it intelligently in ways that I haven't yet like allowed myself to do before? And all that comes down to trust, right? It's like trusting oneself and establishing good enough kind of trust with others, and then having supportive frameworks, supportive communities or contexts to like have that deep inquiry, really give it enough time and supportive nurture to like really kind of hold itself, which doesn't mean hold itself forever only in that way and establish a new metaphysical ground or some other really real thing, but just to really entertain that possibility of relaxing around certain things we've been unwilling to relax through before, and to do it with all of our wisdom on. It's like one of those key Buddhist things that never, like the Buddha never ever said, turn your wisdom off now. Never said that. It was always show up as much as you can. And so this is where for me, and like it really lines up with Integral like very well. It's like turn on all the abilities, all the textures, all the relationships as robustly as I can be, like as fully as big a cosmic address as I can have, not because bigger is better, but because it's more inclusive, it's more integrative, it's actually running more system checks when it's done in a healthy way. Like that's like the kind of like type of embodiment like Buddhism, and specifically Tibetan Buddhism, is trying to allow for. Because in that way, then it's like the multiplicity of different ways to dream is included. And at the same time, it's just, you show up on the dot as much as you can for the beings you're with, like, and then don't like add in anything else. And that's how Buddhism is fundamentally like non-violent or non-dogmatic. They say at the end of any like Buddhist inquiry, the method has to dissolve itself. Like in the end, you actually have to release the framing and just be. So like they say, but it's like that's a question of timing and skill. Like the Buddha Maitreya, they say the fifth Buddha, the next Buddha who's coming, says on the path, you have to be careful about what beliefs and like fixations you give up in what order. So like in the end, Maitreya said, you have to give up the belief in Buddhism too. That's just another belief. But if you give that up too early, like as a set or a suite of ecologies of study and practice, if you give it up too early in the path, like in your actual like maturing, then you actually can get stuck. Like you basically half baked. And then you have no more path to like bake further, but you maybe think you already are fully baked and you're not. So yeah, skillfully like when to kind of ease into larger dreaming scapes and when to like actually kind of like elegantly be with others in their dream modes. Those are like all meta adaptive skills that really take a lot of time and care to do. But and it's very emotionally resonant. Like it has to, we really, that's part of in Buddhism too. Like there is like a process of falling in love with everyone. Like that emotional texture of like you actually deeply care about someone else because they're so amazing. And it's not just someone you're close with, but like so are the strangers and so are the people, the adversaries. Like it really has this ontological kind of bedrock of like everyone has this deeply, like the nature of awareness is wisdom and compassion. It like holds that as an operating principle until you don't need to hold it anymore and you're just seeing the enlightened nature of all beings. That's more Vajrayana vision, more Vajrayana embodiment. But because like you so deeply respect and are grateful for and celebrate other beings and their contributions, that's the emotional hook, is to like, why would you even care to show up in someone else's dream? And it's because they're worth it, because they're extraordinary and you're extraordinary, and like create some extraordinary stuff together and then let it go and compost it as well.
Well, this is a lovely kind of a conversation to have. Um, let's go forward and continue to build some deep trust with each other.
Mm,
Everything you're saying is very much, what Bruce and I are trying to support and what the best integralists and the best Dharma folks all seem to be saying.
mm.
And I'm going to say wonderful things about you.
All right. Cool. Layman, you're a good guy. We've never really had much time, and I really appreciate your time now. But you're really your creative splash to explore like the multifold possibilities of like how we can genuinely create some really good-hearted, embodied things, stuff, coolness together. Like I really admire that. Like it's really like a brave kind of deep core way that you've seemed to have showed up for so many years now. I'm deeply appreciative of it, and like how you're kind of like encouraging us to open the boxes, and like really always like very much gratitude for that, for you. And like, yeah, thank you. Keep it up.
Thank you.